I personally blame Bafana Bafana.
Yes, of course.
Personally. If you look at South Africa's story, our worst moments, democratic South Africa, our worst moments happen when Bafana Bafana is doing its worst.
You're engaging me too much on this.
But I'm saying Bafana Bafana.
Look at
But I'm saying Bafana Bafana.
Okay.
So Bafana Bafana, by the way, is a nickname for their soccer team. Just in case anyone's not in the loop on that. So he's essentially saying that there's a connection between the success of the soccer team and the social and political state of South Africa.
Our soccer team,
when it's
our
bad.
football team, guys, when it's at its worst, the country, that team has an outsized weight on his shoulders that I think they need to acknowledge.
And Kaizer Chiefs.
Guys, you look at 2010. You know what part of the reason 2010 was so good for us? Because we were in the World Cup. We didn't have to qualify for it. We were definitely going to be in it.
Yes.
1998, that whole period, that honeymoon. What were we doing as the soccer team in the country? We were winning. Do you get what I'm saying? And I know this is a stretch, but I do think there's also an element in South Africa of when the rugby team wins, the whites have won. Blacks support the rugby team as well, but the apparatus of it is still seen as like, oh, the white institution did a thing right. When the cricket team wins, they go, yeah, you see the white thing won. When Bafana Bafana loses, crime. You see those crimes? Did you see how they were playing? It's crime, that one. And I'm being serious. And that's why I say like Bafana, Bafana Bafana has an outsized influence on how the country sees itself. Many of my Brazilian friends have said the same thing. They go, when the Brazilian national team is doing well, Brazil is doing well. When we're doing terribly, you'll see more protests, more violence, more everything. And it might just be confirmation bias, but I do think there's something to how the collective experiences its reality based on like a few.
I think it's a consensus decision of how we're doing, expressed in a.
So I'm gonna let this guy finish because this guy made some really good points too. But there was a point at which during this little clip that I just played, Trevor Noah is like, I know this is a stretch, but it's actually not a stretch. There's actually scientific support for what he's saying. And it's like, y'all know how I like to nerd out with y'all sometimes. And so when I heard that, I was just like, oh, this could actually be something to bring up with my audience. Cause like, I don't think I've ever talked about this with y'all, but it's something that I've studied on my own that I think y'all could actually benefit from knowing. And I'm going to tell y'all why after this clip is done.
Very, very small representative example that makes us feel proud.
Yes, that's true.
It's like our very best are the best at the world at a thing that the world cares about. And soccer is the most extreme version of that, because soccer is bigger than any religion. It's bigger than any nation. It's the most practiced cultural thing on the planet. And we are a football nation first and foremost, particularly amongst Black South Africans. We're a football nation first and foremost. And so if football, soccer, our best 11, the boys, Bafana, our best stock are good, we feel good. But if our best offering is getting trashed by, or say, drawing with Lesotho, and no disrespect to Lesotho, but you know how South Africans feel about Lesotho.
That was heavy disrespect.
I couldn't pull down the full study, but I wanted y'all to see some of what's in this article. It says, the fact that athletes experience a tidal rush of testosterone, a hormone associated not just with male sexuality, but with self-esteem upon winning a big game was established. But there was a hypothesis floating around among social psychologists at the time that fans ride a similar hormonal high. Now, at this point, it's important to remember testosterone isn't just related to like manliness, like a lot of people think. Testosterone is something possessed by everyone, regardless of gender, and it's actually associated with self-esteem. In addition to things like being strong, lifting heavy, being competitive, testosterone is associated with self-esteem. So think about that, because he's about to describe how when a fan's team wins, their testosterone spikes. So they're literally experiencing heightened self-esteem when their team wins, right? The game was extremely close, with UGA squeaking out a win at the buzzer. In the post-game chaos, only 8 fans, 4 dogs, and 4 jackets returned their bottles, but the results were compelling. Testosterone levels typically peak shortly after waking each day, then drop about 35% by bedtime. When he got back to the lab, Bernhardt discovered that the testosterone levels of the 4 jubilant winners were 20% higher as they exited into the late night melee outside the Omni than when they entered. Players are known to experience roughly the same increase. The Georgia Tech fans, who lost, meanwhile had a 20% drop, though Bernhardt places less importance on that finding as testosterone levels typically decline at that hour anyway. Soon after, he and his colleagues carried out another test with a larger, more statistically significant pool of subjects, 26 soccer fans watching a Brazil-Italy World Cup game in Atlanta, half at a Brazilian sports bar and half at an Italian sports bar. Again, a 20% increase in testosterone was observed among fans of the winning team, the Brazilians, along with a corresponding 20% drop for the Italians. Statistically, the correlation is very strong. The importance of the experiment was to show that testosterone isn't just about a body getting pumped up. It's not, for want of a better term, about being burly. It is about a sense of status, of seizing the moment. So I just wanted to bring up the abstract of it just to show y'all, like, this is a real study. So the name of the study, for anyone who wants to look this up, is Testosterone Changes During Vicarious Experiences of Winning and Losing Among Fans at Sporting Events. And now you might be thinking to yourself, does this apply to everyone? Yes. So later on, a similar experiment was done with women soccer players, and they found same thing. Like I said, everybody has testosterone regardless of gender. It's just in different amounts. And so essentially, and I'm not going to read this whole abstract, but essentially they found the same thing, only they were also testing for cortisol. But they found that when women were competitive, even if they didn't win yet, that was the interesting thing about the women's studies. Even if they hadn't won or lost, even if the competition wasn't over, competitive women have testosterone spikes. But it's, once again, not just related to being burly, strong, athletic, it's also self-esteem. So basically what we're finding is when it comes to sports, when it comes to being competitive, when it comes to winning, everybody's experiencing these hormones that make them feel good, that make them feel better about themselves, and could possibly impact their performance in various ways. So if you're one of those people who's ever wondered why you get a little bit turned on during or after a sports competition, this could have something to do with it. Now, here's something else that was even more interesting, right? Because once again, Trevor Noah is talking about how the success or failure of their soccer team relates to the social and political climate of South Africa. And then they go on to talk about how the different teams and the racial makeup of those teams kind of impacts public perception, right? So that had me thinking about something that I read a long time ago. So back in 2017, and I'm going to pull up this study, there was a study on tribalism in sports. Now, this is something, if you've once again studied sports marketing, you've probably heard about this too, about tribalism in sports and how a lot of times people will treat when they're fans of a team, they'll treat opposing fans like they're like literally the enemy, and they'll treat common fans like, oh, we're cool because we're both fans of the same team, and not know anything else about each other but what team they're rooting for, right? Tribalism. So there was a study done called Tribal Love, the Neural Correlates of Passion Engagement in Football Fans. And in this sense, by football, they mean soccer. So I'm going to read to y'all some of the overarching factors that led to this study. And then I'm going to tell y'all what they found. And then I'm going to tell y'all how that's connected to what Trevor Noah said. In one paragraph, they said, a strong example of group identification, feeling of belongingness and loyalty is the passion for a football team, which may therefore be viewed as a sort of tribal love. Desmond Morris described in an impactful book this tribal character of the link between not only football players, coaches, and directors, but between the fans and the teams. Football was described as a tribal phenomenon, and the author framed in an evolutionary view how the attachment for a preferred football team and nation has achieved significance for very large audiences. And so I like the fact that they mentioned evolutionary view, because that was something else that really intrigued me when I started studying sports and sports marketing, was how different factors in sports, in terms of just the competition, the tribalism, the in-group versus out-group dynamics that will sometimes play out, and how it's so related to things that have been studied from an evolutionary perspective by like anthropologists and sociologists, right? So the study goes on to say, this issue is indeed relevant in the context of neuroscience, given that sports have overwhelming socioeconomic impact in large communities worldwide. Concerning football, FIFA's 2014 financial report summarizes revenues of over $2 billion in that year. In 2015, the amount spent in transfers of football players in the English Premier League reached £870 million. This reflects the enormous amount of time, energy, and money that fans spend in their commitment to their beloved teams. This form of passionate behavior is defined as a strong type of non-romantic love, binding the fans to their team, and they, as consumers, support the football teams and the leagues, leading to large-scale business models. So this study is basically establishing, time, money, energy, that's all we have as people. And when it comes to sports, sport fans are willing to put so much of that into their favorite teams and their favorite players. So we have to look into the neuroscience behind this, because those are things that contribute to your survival. So when you're willing to sacrifice those things, invest those things into something that really shouldn't impact you, like these are grown men playing a game that you're not involved in. What the hell does that have to do with you to where you're investing so much of your time, energy, and money into it, right? So they're like, let's study this shit. I'm going to go to the conclusion first, just to show y'all that they confirmed some things, but then I'm going to go back to the intro because they use some abbreviations in the conclusion that I want y'all to see in the intro spelled out. Because I don't want there to be any confusion in what I'm about to tell y'all about sports and race, okay? So scrolling. So conclusion. We investigated the neural basis of love for the football team. And I want to pause right there and talk about love, right? Because something else that we don't talk about enough in sports is parasocial relationships. And just to define that, parasocial relationships are basically when you have a celebrity crush. It's when you have that feeling of connection to a person, but you don't really know them. So like when you start feeling like, you've probably seen some fanboys do it when they start talking like they know a player, like they know certain things about a player, like so-and-so wouldn't do that. Oh, he probably he probably thought this. Like a lot of times when people are defending their favorite player and attributing certain characteristics or like a certain mindset to something that they saw their player do, a lot of times that's the impact of a parasocial relationship, which is a one-sided, non-reciprocal relationship where basically, typically it's a fan. You as a fan have become so invested in a player and their story and their success that you feel like there's a connection. You feel like there's a relationship. You feel like this, like you know this person, but they have no idea who the fuck you are. And so it's not always a bad thing. Like there's nothing wrong with having a celebrity crush. There's nothing wrong with having a player crush. Like all of that shit can actually be kind of fun as long as you keep it in perspective. Where it goes bad is when people start stalking motherfuckers or start acting like that particular celebrity or that player like owes them something because of relationship that they've developed in their mind. So like, I love when I have a new celebrity crush. The reason why I love it is because like I have ADHD. So anything that like gives me a dopamine boost, I'm like, I'm here for it. But I know that about myself. I know that shit is not real. I know like, okay, I feel good when I listen to this person's music or listen to this person's interviews or watch their show. I know that that's because I have a crush on this person. So there's all sorts of brain chemicals doing their thing when I hear their voice, when I see their face, right? But there are some people in this world who don't understand what's happening to them when that happens. And that shit goes too far. And that's when it gets dangerous. That's when it gets crazy. So parasocial relationships, look it up. As a sports fan, something you need to be aware of. Anyway, continuing. They talk about this being a type of love, right? We found the involvement of the amygdala and reward system regions such as VTA and SN in the processing of this type of effect. Remember those abbreviations. The observation of an increased response bias in these areas preferentially to positive stimuli of the loved team suggests that this kind of non-romantic love represents a strong motivational state with a bias for processing positive content. So you ever met a sports fan who don't like to hear negative shit about their team? This shit right here. The amygdala is proposed to have a facilitator role in emotional mnemonic processes in the assessment of positive rewarding stimuli, reinforcing behaviors of positive outcome rather than negative ones. Furthermore, fanaticism scores were strongly associated with individual response differences elicited by positive versus negative affective in-group experiences, thus implicating a weighting bias concerning neural responses for reward versus punishment. So that's basically a long and very technical way of saying, like, hey, we studied the neuroscience behind this. We found that the amygdala and reward system regions actually do play a role in fanaticism. And that's why these people are willing to invest so much of their time, energy, and money, because the same parts of the brain that tell them if they're really being rewarded for something are going off when their team wins. The part of the brain that is supposed to assess whether something is a threat, that shit is active when they're watching these games. So they're developing a sense of connection with a team that is similar to what they might have experienced if they were trying to find their place in an actual tribe, if they were actually in the wild, like trying to find food or protect themselves from predators or other threats or other dangers. All that shit is active as they're watching sports and bonding with other fans, right? So let me go to the beginning and talk about what these abbreviations are. And then I'm going to show you what I found. So at the very beginning, it spells out these abbreviations. It says a pool of 56 participants was submitted to an fMRI experimental design involving the presentation of winning and losing football moments of their loved rival or neutral teams. So this would be like if Cowboys fans were put into this experiment. This would be like, all right, they're going to perform an fMRI while they show you clips of like that time that Zeke lined up at center or whatever he was doing and got trucked, or the moment when Dez, according to some people, may or may not have caught it, or like the loss to the Green Bay Packers in the playoffs, stuff like that. So they said, we found recruitment of amygdala and reward regions, including the ventral tegmental area and substantia nigra, as well as other limbic regions involved in emotional cognition for positive versus neutral and positive versus negative. So that's important because they're like, not only did we see how they responded in terms of good versus bad, but we also wanted to see, was any of this even processed as neutral? The latter contrast was correlated with neuropsychological scores of fanaticism in the amygdala and regions within the reward system as the VTA and SN. The observation of increased response patterns and critical components of the reward system, in particular for positive content related to the love team, suggests that this kind of non-romantic love reflects a specific arousal and motivational state, which is biased for emotional learning of positive outcomes. So, what does this have to do with the racial aspect that they started talking about on Trevor Noah's podcast? So these are Google results, but I did verify them. But I want to show y'all some of what it said. So I basically investigated each of the components that study talked about, but I investigated it from the perspective of racism as opposed to sports fanaticism. So when it comes to the role of the amygdala and racism, you've got emotional processing, fear and threat detection, emotional memory, and social cognition. So that last one says, research suggests that the amygdala is involved in processing social information and interpreting cues from others, like facial expressions. So we're talking about a part of the brain that plays this big of a role in social interactions, but that this study just showed us is also very active when it comes to watching sports and bonding with other sports fans. Okay. And then there's other things like threat detection, which if you've ever had a discussion about race or racism, you know that like a lot of times people are describing things as threats and you're just like, huh? So I just felt like I didn't really need to explain that part. But like, yes, the perception of threat is a very big component in why people end up being racist, prejudiced, biased against all sorts of groups. Moving on, the reward regions that study talked about. So we've got the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, and the substantia nigra. So it says the VTA, along with the SN, is a key area in the brain's dopamine-based reward system. So dopamine not only makes you feel good when you're being rewarded, but there are a lot of studies that also show that the presence of dopamine is what makes a person want to keep learning about something. So for if you know anybody who has ADHD and they're like, oh, I went down a rabbit hole on this, a lot of times that's because of dopamine. They learned about something, felt that dopamine hit, and their brain was like, let's keep going, let's keep going, let's keep going, right? It's involved in motivation, reward-seeking behavior, and learning. And then there's the SN, particularly the pars compacta. It plays a crucial role in motor control, but also contributes to dopamine-related functions like reward and habit formation. So now we're looking at this study mentioning regions of the brain that are related to not only social cues and facial expressions, but also motivation, reward-seeking behavior, learning, and habit formation. And then we get into the other limbic regions and emotional cognition. So it lists basically a bunch of areas of the brain in this section next to the limbic system, and says they're responsible for regulating emotions. You ever seen somebody who gets ridiculously upset, like illogically upset when their team loses? So it's responsible for regulating emotions, memory, motivation, and behavior. And then there's emotional cognition, which is how people process, interpret, and respond to emotional information and how emotions influence thoughts, decisions, and actions. So here's where we get to the good part. It talks about the interconnections and potential links to racism. So there's the VTA amygdala pathway, which says research suggests there are connections between the VTA and amygdala. This pathway is implicated in associative learning, reward-seeking behavior, and emotional responses, including fear and anxiety. There's a neuroscience of racism, where it says studies exploring the neural correlates of prejudice have identified brain regions like the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and fusiform gyres as relevant. Focus on the amygdala there. And then there's the amygdala response in race. Some research has found that the amygdala shows differential responses to faces of individuals from different racial groups, especially outgroup members or those associated with negative stereotypes or perceived threat. So now you put this together with what we just read in the study, the same area of the brain that is responsible for people looking at people of other races as a perceived threat is also playing a role in how fans feel about their favorite teams. So being a sports fan and getting attached to a team is literally activating one of the parts of the brain that is largely responsible for racism. Okay, and then there's threat perception and stereotypes. It's suggested that the observed amygdala response in race-related studies may be linked to perceptions of threat. These perceptions potentially stem from culturally learned stereotypes and associations. So in summary, the interplay between the amygdala, reward regions, and other limbic structures involved in emotional cognition likely contributes to the complex neural processes underlying various aspects of social behavior and potentially aspects of race-related responses, including prejudice and bias. So focus on the prejudice and bias part right now. What this is telling us is that some of the same pathways that people that are used, that are activated when it comes to prejudice and bias and race-related responses. According to the study, a lot of those same pathways are related to tribalism in sports. So when we start seeing this correlation between like, hey, when supporters of this team seem to feel really good, like almost like the entire culture shifts when this team is doing really well, it's not a stretch to think that, because what you have is a large population of people all at the same time experiencing hormones that make them feel more confident, that make them feel good, and also hormones that can contribute to actual life events like how they work out, their energy levels, their sex drive, right? And they're also activating parts of their brains that are related to in-group and out-group and reward systems and learning and cognitive behavior and overall tribalism in sports. So that's not a coincidence. And then you incorporate something else that they said in that episode when he was like, oh, when the rugby team wins, it's like the whites won. Well, that has to do with the fact that when you're talking about anything related to social cues, in groups and out groups. There's going to be a part of that that involves, I don't know if mirror neurons is what I want to bring up, but basically a lot of times people are brought in by a sense of belonging in the first place. So, in other words, people don't just up and become sports fans. They don't just up and become fanatics. A lot of times there's something that pulls them in, something that feels familiar in the first place, something that makes them feel safe. Like, how many people do you know who will determine whether or not to go to an event by quote unquote who all gonna be there? Like, people will join events, people will go to events, people will join activities where they feel safe, where they feel accepted, where they feel like they already belong, right? So that's why a lot of times you'll see certain sports have a certain fan base associated with a certain culture. And it's not always just white and black. Like, NASCAR fans are a little bit different than F1 fans. Like, NASCAR fans are different than hockey fans. Golf fans are a little bit different than lacrosse fans, right? So it's not always that, like, oh, this sport has white fans, this sport has black fans. Sometimes it's like, hey, it seems like rich people really like this sport, whereas, this sport seemed to have come from the streets. Kind of like there was actually discussion about that with basketball recently. People were talking about how basketball used to be something that was played in streets, in alleyways, at public parks, and now with the, I guess, popularity of camps and people wanting to develop their kids from such a young age, it's becoming a sport where you have to have money to be competitive. Like, that's a real conversation, because that's something that will over time impact the culture of the sport. It will impact the culture that the sport came from, because if basketball is like taken away, quote unquote, from the streets, what does that mean? Will they come up with another sport that they're associated with? Or will it feel like they no longer have a place in the world of basketball? Like, there's a lot to think about there. But yeah, if y'all want to hear more about it, whether you put it in the chat now or put it in the comments later, we can dig more into this. But I just thought it was really interesting that someone brought this up, and it just made me think about the fact that, like, I don't think a lot of sports fans know this. I don't think a lot of sports fans realize that their actual brain chemicals, their actual hormone levels are being affected by their favorite team, are being affected by their decision to be a sports fan and support a certain team. So if you want to look up this study for yourself, here's the title: Tribal Love, the Neural Correlates of Passion, Engagement in Football Fans. And honestly, this is something that will probably come up again later. And here's why. We are at a point, especially in the US, where there are going to be more opportunities than ever for things like racism, prejudice, and bias to enter the chat when it comes to sports. And part of that is due to things that are happening right now. Football season is about to start. When have we ever had a football season where the conversation of white quarterbacks versus black quarterbacks, and not only their performance, but how they're treated in the media, doesn't come up, right? That's always a thing. And then you've got what's happening in the WNBA with them, negotiating the CBA. All-Star Weekend is going to be held in Indiana, which, if you know anything about the people in Indiana or have heard about Indiana sports fans, Indiana WNBA fans, Caitlin Clark fans, then if you know anything about those groups, then you're already mentally preparing yourself for some bullshit. You're already mentally preparing yourself to hear some crazy ass headlines coming out of that event. Whew. But football season about to start. We're in the middle of WNBA season. So all of that presents opportunities for discussions of race, misogyny, misogynoir, so on and so forth. But then here, get this. There's a lot of shit going on that I don't have to get into, whether you want to talk about what's going on domestically or international relations, or who is or is not pro-Israel or Palestine. There's a lot of conversations happening, which not only lead to opportunities for possible demonstrations by current athletes or current sports fans at sporting events, but we got to think about the fact that we're less than a year into this administration, which, assuming democracy still exists in 2028 and there is another election, before that election happens, we are going to have both the World Cup and the Olympics on US soil. So now we're talking about bringing people from all over the world into a country that's already struggling with racism, xenophobia. When we talk about the Olympics and who's qualified for it, that's when we get into misogyny, because whether you want to admit it or not, discussions of trans athletes are related to discussions of misogyny, because discussions of trans athletes always filter over into who is considered a woman. What does a woman look like? What's acceptable testosterone levels for a woman? What's acceptable chromosome makeup? Because we've seen people be disqualified from the Olympics, not because how some people would say they chose to be trans, because they're like, let's assume it is a choice, right? Let's assume that's a choice. And there are some people who decide to change their gender. There have been people who did not make that decision, but because they were intersex, were disqualified from competing. In other words, a person was just born a certain way. Doctors or whoever made a decision about putting whatever they put on their birth certificate. And then this person grows up, becomes a phenomenal athlete. And they're like, hey, we see that you're a great athlete. You're so good at what you do. You run so fast. You're amazing. But we can't really get down with what's going on in your pants. So yeah, no, you're not allowed to compete at the highest level. And it's like, what? These are people who didn't have any surgery. In some cases, they have a less common chromosome makeup, because a lot of people think everybody's XX or XY. Truth is, there are some people who are XXY or XYY. There are different makeups, right? And so those conversations invite a lot of misogyny, because what always happens is people be like, real women don't da da da. Like when people say shit like, she can't have children. Bitch, I don't know if I can have kids. So what you saying about me? Am I not a woman now? You know what I'm saying? So like all of this stuff comes up. So you got misogyny, you've got racism, you've got xenophobia that are all already just like on the radar. And now we've got these huge international events coming to US soil. And so I feel like for those of us who are capable of handling these conversations from an informed perspective, and who are capable of having these conversations in a respectful way, because I'm not saying these conversations should definitely be shut down. In order to find solutions, we have to have these conversations. But there's a way to do it. There's a way to do it where people can be respected, can be heard, and we can actually find solutions instead of just attacking one another. And so I think having information like this, understanding that no, it's not a stretch to see a connection between people feeling a certain way and how their team is performing. It's not a stretch to see this correlation between certain races feeling a certain way about certain players or certain teams. It's literally neuroscience. It's literally sociology. All of it comes into play. Like, this is not just, why are sports fans like this? Because we're human, and humans are wired this way. So I hope that was informative for y'all. I hope y'all enjoyed it, because I kind of like going down this rabbit hole. Maybe instead of bitches love sports, I should be like nerds love sports. Because I feel like this episode was definitely like heavy on the nerd and not so much on the bitch. But y'all show up for all of it, and I appreciate that.